Hello, and welcome back to another episode of English 300. I'll try and be as deliberate as I can. This is designed to be a review, kind of pointing you in the direction that you should be looking in terms of finding either terms or some of the readings. Obviously, I'm not going to give you the prompt just yet. This is more of a precursor to the stuff that will come later in the module. So I'm going to break this up into a few parts. Hopefully I can be as complete as possible. But I'm going to start basically on Module 1. As you can see, I skipped the earlier modules here, 0 and start here, because although they're probably useful and interesting, they are not necessarily going to be the bulk of what you're going to be asked to do. In Module 1, it's sort of a mixture of the establishment of some ideas, some terms, some basic things that you should know going into the semester, if you recall. And then later on, as we get closer to the end of the module, there is some actual readings here that you can that you should also probably look at. I know you've probably already looked at it before, but at this point, it could be helpful to review by reading, either rereading the material or looking at your answers, anything like that. The way the module is, the way the midterm, I should say, is going to be set up is that you're going to see, you can probably go pretty quickly now to the setup, basically on how the midterm is going to be set up. It's in two parts, but I won't over-explain that because I think you can read most of that. That's going to be open all week, as well as these particular videos. You can go to those sort of at your leisure, but what will not be open just yet is the part 1 and part 2, which is the quiz, which is mostly just terms, and then the second part is some short answer questions, but I'll let you read that on your own. This will just be basically a review of the material from earlier. So I'm going to start on Module 1 because that's kind of where the meat of the course gets started. And again, in the second half of this is where the readings are actually taking place. The terms are probably helpful to know. I'll go to one sort of as an example. If I were a student looking through this, I would see here the readings for the week. They may be, I want to have those on the brain at some point because I don't know exactly which ones I'm going to be asked to work with, and you will be asked to work with them in interesting ways, I hope. That is, to keep you engaged, but also the other reason is I'm hoping that my questions are unique enough where they're going to be your own answers, if you know what I mean. Copying and pasting, all of that stuff, even though I know that there's probably some teachers that fear that quite a bit, I'm hoping, and beyond hope, I'm thinking that the requirement will be is that the uniqueness of the questions will sort of force you to provide your own answers, and I take into account the fact that this is not going to be perfect. I'm looking more for how you read the questions. For example, if I ask you to compare a couple of these readings, I'm going to be focused, as I explain in the prompt, about how you compare rather than just whether you have memorized everything in there or whether you can copy and paste a summary of the material, right? That's not really, if I'm not asking you to do that for the bulk of the question, I'm looking for more how you in particular will compare the two readings. And these readings will be mixed up enough where I don't think you'll be able to really do that very effectively unless you actually think about these readings. And again, I'm going to be using one of the reasons I introduced the midterm with the the terminology is just to remind you that some of these terms are not really the same way that I use that they get used in the general public. Okay, so make sure that you understand that. So to that point, like for example, here we have Welcome to the Week, preface to evaluating ideas, and then there's a video. I'm assuming that you have seen these videos, and you'll see in these videos some references to these terms as well, like rhetoric. Later on I go into narrative, maybe not in this particular video, but all of these videos may be good to listen to, if only not because I'm particularly engaging, or interesting all the time, but because they do give you a feel for sort of how I respond and how I look through things. Okay, so that's the first thing that I would spot, is that There's a couple of readings here that I want to be familiar with, have them on the brain, and then there's a video here that kind of gives me a feel for what the teacher, meaning me, how the teacher looks at some of these ideas, okay? They're not in any way complete. They're mostly just introductory type things, but they do give you a pretty good feel. So if I were you, I would probably have that voice on the brain, because that's kind of what that's the voice, obviously, that's going through my head as I'm putting together this stuff, okay? So in the introduction, we have Use of Force, which is, of course, by Carlos Williams. That was a story. You did a response to that, so you should have some material waiting for you on that. So that is fair game. Allegory of the Cave is probably also fair game. I may borrow some terminology from either one of these, or I may use these as examples of something that I want you to analyze. So that's basically in Module 1. Some of these other videos and reference in some of these terms, critical thinking, make sure you're aware of what that is, because that's going to lie into the expectations. And in most of these modules, you'll also see, if you remember, key terms, right? All those key terms are fair game, okay? So that would be something to look at and make sure that you understand these ideas, okay? Something like rhetorical situations, elements of written response are really more background than anything else, but they do consolidate some of the bigger ideas within the modules if you're having trouble sort of swallowing it all at once. Let me go back to Module 1. I'm just going to see if I can, building an argument, that's could be a good one to review, because that's what you're going to be doing for the most part. You're going to be responding, comparing, but mostly arguing your point of view. It's okay to insert yourself into some of these, because if the question asks for it, that goes back to the idea of remembering that the question that you're being asked is really, really important that you understand, because that's the specificity of answering that question is probably going to determine the success or failure of any response. It's one thing to read a question and then go and do your research or whatever, and then answer a question that you think was asked, or a question that may be better than the one that you have a better answer for a question that wasn't asked, so you kind of go with that response. Sometimes that's a habit that people have if they're not, if they don't have these readings on the brain, or if they don't have my voice in their head, or the way we analyze things in the class on their brain. Maybe they're really fuzzy on sort of some of the ways that we've been working with these things for whatever reason, either through lack of attention sometimes, other times it's just, you think you got it, and then you don't really have it, so you kind of start reading the question. I know my daughter has this problem, not to get too personal, but when you do read a question, make sure that you understand the question that's being asked. That's my best advice for you on that. Okay? So so Module 1 is more, there's a lot of terminology here that would be good to know. Some strategies that I think are helpful, but probably also the meat of this, that these would all be covered probably if I choose some stuff in there from the terms. That would be in sort of the multiple choicey type stuff. So as you go through this, the first half of this module is probably a better place to start grabbing some terminologies. And then also I think that also goes with some of these other modules, but I'll go over that later. But then as you go into the end of Module 1, and again, Module Summary may also help. I just showed you that real quick. That might also help you, just like the introduction with the terms. Gives you an idea of what you just worked on. But essentially, through the end of this, other than that Module Summary, and then into the second one, that's where the meat of the readings come in, okay, and how you've worked with them. Like my advice would be to go to these discussion boards, because you've had some back and forth with other students, so you might gain some perspectives on some of this material. All of this is helpful to do beforehand, because you don't want to wait until things open, because then to do your basic review, because at that point, the clock is ticking, and I'll sort of leave the due dates and stuff open for you to look at. I should say I'm not going to go over them extensively in these videos. But here we have a couple of readings. We have the Joseph Campbell, which we spent some time on. That's fair game, but I also understand that you have done a paper on this, so I probably will be either very sparing with the direct questions about Campbell and the monomyth, but I could possibly use it as a comparison or as a way of saying, okay, use Campbell for something else, okay? So it may be helpful in the background, but I'm not going to make you write another paper on Campbell, essentially, or another short answer on exclusively Campbell. That's likely not going to happen if you've already written a paper on it. Likewise, now that it's on the brain, even though it's a little bit later, as we get into, let me skip to, no, okay. I don't know where blue collar brilliance is, but blue collar brilliance was also one that was pretty directly responded to. There it is. In 2-3, I should have just kept going. So Campbell and blue collar brilliance are useful in that I can assume that most people have read them because I know for a fact that everybody's turned in something on it. But it'll likely be used as sort of context for some of this other stuff that maybe got used a little bit less. That's just my instincts. My instincts are to kind of go with the things that most people, or at least maybe not, it's not you guys' fault, it might be my fault. I didn't necessarily, dig too deeply into these, and I kind of just told you in some of these, maybe even some of the modules to, hey, I'll return to this later. Okay, so personal and collective unconscious would be a good one to think about in terms of the meat of it. And again, you did a dialectical journal. That would be a good place to go for the Jung if you did complete that. And if you didn't complete it, then look at the structure of that because that really does give you some ideas for note-taking, okay? So that was actually, I thought, a pretty useful assignment for anybody that's looking to review. So look at the T-journal entries because those can be useful in that they already establish something that you've looked at specifically within Jung and then started to respond already. Okay, so that's another bit of structure that I kind of like. That idea of taking some details from these and then responding to them more directly. It allows me to be a little bit less generic because I can be very selective of sort of which parts of these I take and then just present you with either some quotes or a summary of one section. That's something that I am probably likely to do as well. Again, I'm still building the questions for the second half of the midterm, so I'm not revealing any confidences. This is just sort of where I'm at mentally at this point. Okay, so I've gone over probably the first 3-ish modules to show you a little bit about where to look, more like 2-ish, the actual 2 modules. And then for the second half of this, I'm probably going to go into, keep going on this and show you some ideas for themes, follow it up with, how you can look at things thematically because that's kind of where things start to consolidate into module 3. Okay? So I hope that was helpful. I'll see you again in in part 2, and then hopefully we can get to where we need to go. All right, thank you.